For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ranjit Khanna. I'm the director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, which is where you are this morning. And starting this semester, early on this semester, with Carla Holloway and Kathy Davidson, and then over next semester, we're hosting a series of discussions about the humanities at Duke as a way of highlighting the distinctiveness of the effort here, the ongoing high quality of the research and scholarship in the area, and a commitment, perhaps we should say, at this point, the right to a humanities education. As you know, the story goes that in the 1980s, when a decision was made to make Duke into a top-notch university, there was substantial investment into the humanities, and much effort was made to hire scholars who were already established and who had a vision for what our fields should or could look like. In turn, they hired people, both senior and junior, to fulfill that vision. Many of these people were and remain some of the most significant scholars of our time. And those who arrived early brought with them experiences from other universities and thrilling times in those universities in the development of humanities research. Sometimes there were moments, these were moments of upheaval, scholarly, politically, intellectually, that allowed new visions. Certainly, they were in response to a sense of a need for change, such that, for example, desegregation at universities was not just a matter of inclusion, but could force a change in discussion that demonstrated the supplement that upheld the status quo. That status quo often prevented, in the past, academics from being innovative. More than tools of the state was the hope now troubling, daring on all scales of their scholarship, but also solid. I'm truly delighted in this context to welcome this morning someone who was certainly shaped by various moments, tumultuous moments in the academy, and in a manner of always being the gentleman, changed the ways in which we work in the humanities very gently. Reflecting on Gregson Davis's career, Professor Emerita Peter Burian put it really beautifully. Quote, Gregson is a true cosmopolitan, in the first instance raised as an Afro-Greek, to borrow a phrase from his friend, the late Derek Walcott, by the English tradition of classical education on his home island of Antigua. Gregson excelled in that curriculum, but upon finishing his schooling, did not take the next obvious step of enrolling at Oxford or Cambridge, opting instead for Harvard. He flourished there as well, winning the Latin Translation Prize all 4 years and finishing in glory as the Latin orator at his graduation. Then he was off to California, graduate school at Berkeley, started teaching at Stanford, where he remained for 20 years. The choice of an American education and career made him a transcultural, interdisciplinary cosmopolitan in a way that would have been far harder to achieve in Britain. Along the way, he became not only perhaps the leading Horatian of his generation in this country, but also an essential translator and interpreter of Aimé Césaire, the great Martinican Francophone poet. When you consider, end quote, right? When you consider the manner in which the poetry of the Caribbean and the form and genre of the epic remain absolutely compelling there, and in a way that has branched out from the Caribbean, it is perhaps not a surprise that we must consider through and with Gregson the structures of colonial education that cemented both a love and care for works that were shaping traditions and also radically questioning them. Gregson graduated with his PhD from Berkeley in 1969, and so at a time of strong protests at Berkeley concerning interrelated struggles over the civil rights movement, the free speech movement, and the Vietnam War protests. He taught at Stanford for 20 years at the height of the culture wars and the drama around, for example, the teaching of I. Rigoberta Menchú. And he taught and served at Cornell as Goldwin Smith Professor of Classics and Comparative Literature from 1989 to 1994, during and in the aftermath of the theory wars and the beginnings of the ethical turn, which grappled with the political leanings of various theoretical projects. These would all come to shape his approach, I think, and also gave him a serious curiosity about all manner of things. And I'm really delighted that he's a regular presence at many of our events over here at FHI. He served as chair of Classics and Dean of the Humanities at both Cornell and at Duke. But before all that, Gregson was at core, I think, a comparatist fundamentally, never shying away from dwelling on the works of Horace and Aimé Césaire at the same time, so working with figures in multiple languages across the world from each other, with centuries between them. He's the author of numerous monographs, as well as a skilled translator. For example, from 2017, the really beautiful bilingual edition of the Journal of a Homecoming, or the Cahier d'un retour au pays natal, the English translation of Césaire. He is the author of Parthenope, The Interplay of Ideas in Virgilian Bucolic, from 2012. I'm laughing here because I just said to Gregson, just let me say this and then tell me if the stress is wrong. And he said, you know, it's perfectly legitimate at this point. For a post-colonialist like me, in fact, to take on your own pronunciation of such things. But anyway, there we are. There we are. From 1997, Aimé Césaire from Cambridge University Press. From 1991, Polyhymnia, The Rhetoric of Horatian Lyric Discourse, from the University of California Press. From 1984, Non-Vicious Circle, 20 Poems of Aimé Césaire, from Stanford. From 1983, The Death of Procrus, Amor and the Hunt in Ovid's Metamorphosis, from Ateneo, from Rome in 1983. And from 1971, from Scrimshaw, Antigua Black, Portrait of an Island People. In 2022, he gave the 14th of probably the most prestigious lecture in the classics, in the field of classics, the Haussmann Lectures, and this can actually be found online. The Reception of Lucretius on the Nature of Things in Aimé Césaire's Journal of a Homecoming, from 2022. And today, his talk is titled Towards the Flourishing of Transcultural Humanities. Please join me in welcoming him back to FHI.
Well, my very heartfelt thanks go to Ranji for giving me this opportunity to take part on, however modest the scale, in the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Franklin Humanities Institute. As she has indicated, I was privileged to have been present at the birth, growth, and spectacular maturation of the FHI. I'm also decidedly fortunate to have made the acquaintance of the legendary John Hope Franklin during my halcyon days of teaching at Stanford in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and to have had his son, John Hope Franklin Jr., as a student in my graduate seminar on the great French Caribbean poet Aimé Césaire, at a time when post-colonial studies were beginning to go into orbit in the very shadow of Hoover Tower. All unlikely places. The invitation to deliver this talk marks a timely coincidence in my life story, since I've just recently embarked on the project of composing my memoirs, at the urging of my children, my memoirs in the third year of my post or pseudo-retirement, I should say, from Duke at the advanced age of 83. In shaping my talk along the lines suggested by Ranji, I'll be focusing on a few transformative episodes in the formation of my vision for what I've come to label transcultural humanities. By the way, that title was is the one that I gave to a symposium when I was dean, which is some time ago now. And I was looking for the poster that I created at the time. I was not able to find it. But anyway, I called it Transcultural Humanities. My reflections on the topic will unfold in a series of 4 short sections. In the first, I will give you some autobiographical background on my pre-college education in the former British Caribbean colony of Antigua, as a prelude to describing my radical intellectual reorientation during my exciting undergraduate experience at Harvard in the late 50s, and my no less enlightening period as a graduate student at UC Berkeley in the political crucible of the 60s. In the third section, I will turn my attention to my role in implementing my enhanced vision for the direction of the humanities during my 2 enjoyable decades of teaching and pursuing research in both classics and comparative literature. I will conclude this informal talk with some gestures towards what I see as the urgent potential role facing the humanities in adapting its central mission to addressing the present crisis in higher education that is casting an increasingly dark cloud over human social progress on the planet. I credit my father, Oliver, for having inculcated a rebellious attitude to English imperialism via the hilarious anecdotes he would recount to his children about his experiences in the model sugar colony of Barbados, when along with his future wife, Evelyn, he was a student at the renowned Teachers Training College there. For instance, he relished telling about his report card at the end of his training in which the school principal wrote about him, "This student is quick to note offenses and the first to voice them. He has Bolshevistic tendencies and should be watched." My father at the time had no clue what the word Bolshevist meant. Anyway, another incident which he loved to relate was sort of like a Dickensian incident where he was served a lunch meal. The students were served a lunch meal, and at the cafeteria, and there were flies on the food. And my father complained, of course, about the flies on the food. And the principal, or at least the person in charge, said, "When I was in Mesopotamia," we threw the flies off the meat. So my father said, "Well, sir, we're not in Mesopotamia now." On British colonial chauvinism, he would always, with penetrating humor, point out the ironies in the lines from the song, "Rule Britannia." "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves." Have you heard that one? Yeah. Equally subversive of the colonialist ideological system was his disclosure of the class oppression mentality in the words he quoted from a well-known Protestant hymnal. "The rich man in his castle," this is actually a hymn, a Protestant hymn, Anglican hymn. "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate." Imagine singing that in the church at Anglican Cathedral in those days. His biting wit planted in me the seeds of moral indignation at British colonial policies that included the involvement of the Anglican Church in dispensing what Marx famously described as the opiate of the people. An important aspect of my early intellectual formation, or Bildung, to borrow a useful German expression, came into my purview when I was preparing to take the Cambridge Higher School Certificate exam at the Antigua Grammar School, which was the main secondary school on the island. Some of you may be familiar with the system. Those of you who have experience in colonial countries, British colonial countries. But the Antigua Grammar School, despite its title, was actually a secondary school on the model of the French lycée or the German lyceum. And it really took you through in the sixth form, as they called it then, the final form, through some really advanced work, mostly in the humanities. Soon after the extraordinary news arrived that my elder sister Cecile and I had been awarded tuition scholarships to attend Harvard and Radcliffe College, respectively, I was blessed with a surprise visit from Carl Reisman, then a doctoral candidate in anthropology at Harvard. Carl, who had been conducting dissertation fieldwork on Antiguan Creole in its social context, dropped by the family home in St. John's with a heavy load of books on loan from the local public library. This pile contained works of a few canonic Russian novels by Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, which Carl presented for my perusal as a counterweight to the staple British colonial diet of Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, etc. This episode presaged the initial broadening of my educational horizons during my upcoming undergraduate experience in Cambridge, Mass., where Carl took his Antiguan fledglings under his wing and became a pivotal intellectual mentor who encouraged me to enroll in, as well as audit, courses in the flourishing field of cultural and social anthropology, cultural anthropology, as it was called at Harvard. So profoundly effective was this informal mentorship that I even contemplated at one stage shifting my concentration from classics, in which I was fully ensconced, to the related fields of social anthropology and sociolinguistics. I began to immerse myself in extracurricular reading of key works by leading American anthropologists, such as Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. Benedict's eloquent exposition of the concept of cultural relativism in her book, Patterns of Culture, was transformative for me, a precocious young scholar of classical philology, with a thorough but narrowly focused preparation in the rigorous classrooms of a British insular colony. Ruth Benedict's masterpiece was, in my rapidly evolving worldview, magically pivotal for my growth, as it challenged in very elegant prose the false dichotomies between primitive and civilized societies and deconstructed the hierarchical Eurocentric ideology perpetuated by the dominant colonizing empires in the Antilles and elsewhere, of course, mainly English, French, Spanish, and Dutch empires. Exhilarated by these anti-colonial insights, I delved into Marxist theory as a spin-off from a brilliant general education class in the social sciences taught by the legendary Harvard professor Samuel Beer. Selections from Das Kapital opened my eyes to the systematic exploitation of the working classes in industrialized Europe and its far-flung colonial empires. I began to understand the fundamental dependence of the New World imperialist economy on the transatlantic slave trade and the insidious cultural propaganda that helped to sustain the plantation system in the Caribbean. On the literary front, a cultural anthropological outlook led to my exploration of the corpus of newly emergent Anglophone Caribbean novelists, such as the Barbadian George Lamming and the Trinidadian V.S. Naipaul, and poets of the stature of the St. Lucian Nobel laureate Derek Walcott, the Barbadian scholar-poet Edward Kamau Brathwaite, and the innovative Jamaican Creole language poet Louise Bennett. With the discipline of classics, I soon found ample support for my revisionist cultural dethronement of the West in the critical writings of the so-called Cambridge School of British scholars, classical scholars, who were influenced by the social thought of Durkheim, Malinowski, and Lévi-Brühl, among others, to bring to light the so-called, quote, primitive components in Greco-Roman culture. Chief among these intellectual giants, who adopted a comparative approach to study of Greek piety in particular, were the literary scholars Gilbert Murray and E.R. Dodds. The latter authored the penetrating study, The Greeks and the Irrational, as well as his edition with sophisticated commentary on Euripides' play, The Bacchae, in which the female devotees of the Dionysian cult took center stage. Dodds's work enabled me to grasp the generic affiliations between religious cults, such as Afro-Caribbean Asian voodoo, or voodoo, and ancient Greek Dionysian possession, an analogy famously dramatized by the great Nigerian writer Wole Soyinka in his play, The Bacchae of Euripides, a Communion Rite, which alludes to scenes of ritual possession exemplified in Yoruba religious practices. Very similar to this kinds of ritual possession goes on in Haiti, Haitian religion. I should mention here a member of the group, the Cambridge School, Jane Harrison, whose work has been sort of neglected and, if not in some cases, downgraded in the field. But Jane Harrison, did some very subversive research on, quote, primitive elements in ancient Greek religion. Her most famous work, Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion, is one that was very revealing and influential in my own work. My cross-cultural study of religious institutions that manifest ritual possession benefited immensely from the work of the eminent anthropologist I.M. Lewis in his path-breaking volume, Ecstatic Religion, a study of shamanism and spirit possession. The profound investigations carried out by members of the Cambridge School have been sadly marginalized by latter-day mainstream classical philologists, who, with a few notable exceptions, have largely clung to the bankrupt notion of a superior and, to their minds, far from primitive Greek civilization based on the supreme rule of reason. In this regard, I never tire of relating my fortuitous exposure to one such exception in my sophomore year at Harvard, an eminent contributor to an early edition of the prestigious Cambridge Ancient History, who was a visiting professor at Harvard. This gentleman, who was in his 80s at the time, started to discuss early history of Greece in a course on a very obscure to non-classicists war called the Lantine War. But he was very interesting. He casually said in his very first lecture, he says, you know, when the Greeks emerged from the Dark Ages, he meant, of course, pre-classical period, archaic period, he says, there were three signs that they had, that the civilization to come. And he said, well, the first was in writing, right? The second, he said, was the sculpture of the work of sculpture in stone, and the third was the Olympic Games. And then he said, writing the Greeks got from the Phoenicians, learned from the Phoenicians, and then he said, of course, working in stone, sculpture in stone, was directly borrowed from the Egyptians. And he just went on casually like that. So it turns out that Greek came out of the Dark Ages by learning from the ancient cultures that surrounded it, including the Egyptians. Upon graduation from Harvard in 1960, an occasion marked by my delivery of the Latin oration at the commencement exercises, I took my expanding vision of a humanities devoid of Eurocentric distortions back to Antigua, where I taught for 1 year at my alma mater, the Antigua Grammar School, as a temporary replacement for my former Latin teacher, the erudite Barbadian Alfred Blackett, who had taken a year's leave to complete a doctorate in classics at the University of London. Employed to teach Latin, French, and Roman history, I extended my passionate advocacy of cultural relativism to the public sphere in Antigua, where I ran a radio program on Caribbean literature for the Antiguan Broadcasting Service and worked to elevate the status of the Anglophone Creole language that had been denigrated as, quote, bad English. I remember once I was reading from, I think, a novel by a Trinidadian author who had a lot of Creole dialogue. And I was confronted the day after I gave the broadcast by one of the educators who ran a secondary school, a private secondary school in Antigua. A wonderful woman, but she grew up, of course, in the colonial school system and was very committed to making sure that proper English was taught in the school. And she confronted me and she berated me for speaking Creole on the radio. Said, you went to Harvard and you come back and you're speaking all that in dialect and Creole and to our Antiguan young people when we're trying to eradicate it. So that's the state of play there. Yeah. Anyway, this engagement in the task of cultural decolonization was crucially abetted by my reading of the work of outstanding British Caribbean intellectuals. Chief among them were the renowned Trinidadian Marxist scholar C.L.R. James, author of the classic monograph on the Haitian Revolution entitled Black Jacobins, and the economic historian and politician Eric Williams, whose book Capitalism and Slavery provided an astute analysis of the roots of Anglo-American racist ideology in the colonizers' need to justify the brutal exploitation of people of African descent. After a transitional year and a half of fellowship-funded travel in Europe, mainly in France, Italy, and Germany, I re-entered the academic grove by enrolling in the PhD program in the newly inaugurated Department of Comparative Literature at UC Berkeley. This extension of my cross-cultural literary studies could not have taken place at a more auspicious historical moment. Berkeley in the 60s was the virtual matrix of the new politically engaged American student, the American student movement that boldly confronted the higher administration leadership of major universities with nationwide sit-in demonstrations, such as those prompted by the free speech movement at Berkeley. Organizations such as the Students for a Democratic Society joined forces with charismatic leaders of the civil rights movement and took to the streets to march against institutionalized racist policies, and more broadly, the power of the military-industrial complex as manifested most blatantly in the Vietnam War and the material support of fascist dictatorships in Latin America and the Caribbean. The socio-political upheavals of the 60s that engulfed the San Francisco Bay Area also led to the founding of the iconic Black Panthers movement, the Black Panther Party, as well as that of the largely white middle-class hippie movement of an alienated younger generation. These monumental developments in the public sphere were to have a profound impact on the institutions of higher education in the US as a whole, from within the no longer isolated domain of university and college campuses. Students had begun to make their voices heard in the larger world. This, of course, is resonating with what's going on today as I look at what's happening in Columbia and other schools. My growing awareness of the disjunction between proclaimed American democratic values and the harsh reality of entrenched racial prejudice against people of color, including the indigenous non-European population of the Americas, combined with the inveterate misogyny of the privileged white upper classes, stimulated my interest in helping to promote a radically transcultural perspective in the humanities departments. The establishment of comparative literature PhD programs in elite universities was a tentative first step in this direction, since it led gradually to the decline of a narrowly Eurocentric orientation in traditional humanistic studies. In the case of Stanford University, for example, where I was recruited to the faculty in the late 60s with a joint appointment in classics and the newly founded program in comparative literature, the inspiring leadership of Herbert Lindenberger paved the way to the burgeoning study of what came to acquire the sobriquet of world literature. The curricular landscape of humanities departments was enriched virtually overnight by sorry, I lost my track here, by the inclusion of canonic texts from non-Western civilizations, such as those originating in the ancient Near East, Asia, and pre-colonial Africa. Graduate students enrolled in the complete program had the opportunity to pursue research along comparative lines in their own chosen configuration of literary traditions. Not surprisingly, this major enlargement of horizons culminated a decade or so later in the so-called culture wars that erupted at Stanford University. These famous campaigns were waged in an arena of vibrant ideological contestation, in which I found myself poised to play a minor, though not insignificant part, on the side of progressive reforms designed to overhaul instruction protocols over a wide range of humanistic disciplines. A brief account of my active participation in the effort to transform the curricular requirements deemed fundamental to the liberal education of the first-year student population at Stanford is a necessary prerequisite to clarifying the terms of my vision of genuine cross-cultural humanities. In doing so, I want to emphasize that this vision was shared by a large number of like-minded colleagues in the fields of social sciences as well as humanities. Under the enlightened stewardship of the Stanford president, Donald Kennedy, a faculty committee was charged with re-examining the social relevance and normative values embedded in the Western culture course that is a required feature of the first-year undergraduate experience. The long-established requirement was modeled to a large extent on the Great Books course tracks that originated at Columbia University, a model widely imitated in various liberal arts colleges across the country. Needless to say, the Greco-Roman literary canon constituted the core of the Western culture reading list. The culture wars lived up to their provocative name. The struggle to overcome the institutional inertia of received opinion, what the economist John Kenneth Galbraith was to refer to as conventional wisdom, was by no means easy. The debate that subsequently took place on the Stanford campus over the possible elimination of the Western culture requirement was protracted and heated, to put it mildly. As it happens, the chair of the Stanford Faculty Council in those years was none other than Nan Cohen, who was destined to become, as you know, the president of Wellesley, and in due course to become the first female president of Duke University. I'm rather fond of relating an episode that occurred during the debate that encapsulates the historical reaction on the part of a segment of the faculty to the prospect of changing the requirement. This is really funny. So Nan Cohen was presiding over the Senate, and at one point, the debate got very, very heated, and a very distinguished professor, who will go unnamed, in the history department, stood up and said that, what's all the fuss? He says, let's just face it. The Western civilization has produced, you know, the greatest this and that. And the other, and we just should accept that. And there was silence in the hall at that point. But then a young assistant professor, I think he was in history, but he got up and he said, I wonder if Professor so-and-so has ever tried to balance his checkbook in Roman numerals. Anyway, the committee in charge of innovation in the undergraduate curriculum eventually produced a mandate for a new course whose title reflected the transcultural imperative. It was called Cultures, Ideas, Values, CIV. The acronym CIV, a neatly conceived substitute for the term Western civilization, CIV. So that was a great moment. To implement the landmark curricular reform, the committee invited departments and programs in the social sciences and humanities to propose course tracks that incorporated the underlying objective of multicultural inclusion. I cite from the document articulating the Senate mandate addressed to the teaching faculty. This is a very interesting document, and this is what we received from the Professor Paul Robinson, the religion department, who was in charge of the whole operation. He's talking about the tracks that he wanted to see implemented to satisfy the new requirement, and some of the criteria for constructing such tracks. And he begins with diversity. A, social, to further understanding of self, others, and society, and therefore to confront issues relating to class, ethnicity, race, religion, gender, and sexual orientation. This is way back in the 60s. Huh? To include the study of works by women, minorities, and persons of color. B, geographical, to further understanding of the diverse ideas and values that have shaped American society and culture by studying works from at least one of the European cluster of cultures and from at least one of the non-European cultures that have become components of our diverse American society. The ideas and values expressed in each work shall be treated in their own terms and, to the extent possible, within their own cultural and historical context. And then C was historical, to have a substantial historical dimension. Tracks should analyze the temporal relationship of works to each other and examine some of the political, social, economic, and material contexts of the works. The tracks need not be strictly chronological or comprehensive in their coverage. All tracks should include treatment of ancient and medieval cultures, and the past 6 to 8 centuries in particular deserve to be treated in a substantial manner. That was very enlightened at the time. Yes, very enlightened indeed. Okay. In response to the call for inventing tracks under the proposed guidelines, I was happy to collaborate with 2 colleagues from disciplines other than classics in offering a course we called Europe and the Americas. This was the first offering that was made in the track. Our interdisciplinary teaching troika was composed of a classicist with interest in comparative literary theory, that's myself, a cultural anthropologist, Renato Rosaldo, and a linguistic scholar, Mary Louise Pratt, whose insightful book, Towards a Speech Act Theory of Literary Discourse, constitutes an outstanding contribution to literary critical theory. It's nice to have seen Mary here in this room not so long ago. She was an invited speaker here and gave a recent presentation at the invitation of the FHI. I quote a passage from an excellent article in the Christian Science Center of January 25th, 1989, in illustration of the stir caused by our joint experiment in cultural inclusion. And this of some interest here has a picture of Renato Rosaldo in this article in the education section of the Monitor. Measured in gallons of ink used, the great debate at Stanford University around how or whether to teach Western civilization was one of the last year's biggest education stories. And the story is not over. At Stanford, which is running neck and neck with Yale or Harvard as the nation's premier university, attempts to open up its core required liberal arts course to works by women and minorities, the school faces challenges ranging from lack of qualified professors to strong criticism of experimental courses. Experimental courses like the one I just described. With what began as a small on-campus effort, largely by black students, to replace the popular freshman Western culture requirement with a course less weighted by a male Eurocentric great books approach, became last spring a national media debate over what the next generation of Americans should learn about their intellectual heritage. Were standards being lowered? Was the American's mind as Stanford opening or closing? At Stanford opening or closing? This is a reference to the popular book, Closing the American Mind. That was Alan Bloom's contribution to the debate. Dubious of dubious. A compromise was reached in April. By 1990, the core reading list would be reduced from 16 to 5 titles. Each course would have to include works on race, class, gender, and at least one non-European culture. References to the West would be reduced, as in the new title of the course, Culture, Ideas, and Values. The first CIV course is now being taught and already is under attack. That's the one that I was involved in there. Titled Europe and the Americas. It is an examination of the West that stresses its ties to Spanish and Latin American cultures. Major Western works are read alongside Latino writers. Augustine's Confessions, for example, are read with a Navajo life testimony. And I, Rigoberto Menchú, the autobiography of a 23-year-old Guatemalan feminist revolutionary, to compare types of ethnic self-examination. It is the most exciting teaching I've done in 19 years, says anthropology professor Renato Rosaldo, who adds that by reading such books together, they all got better. The Navajo becomes a book of wisdom. The Wall Street Journal, however, in a hammering December 22nd editorial, criticized an overt leftist political agenda in the course. Rather than illuminate the West, the replacement authors mainly attack it. It goes on that vein. Yes. So, in my segment of the track and the course, I assigned, among other cross-cultural pairings, readings of heroic epic narratives from the ancient Near East, along with the Homeric poems, and Aimé Césaire's anti-colonialist play, A Tempest, along with Shakespeare's Tempest. In short, the Stanford reform allowed me and my friends and colleagues to implement my vision of a humanities that lived up to its etymological credentials, humanities. Concurrent developments in other humanist fields at Stanford, humanities fields, I should say, at Stanford, amplified the lines of my implementation of a transcultural outlook. Chief among these was the foundation of a Department of African and Afro-American Studies, which is entrusted to the eminent Black sociologist Sinclair Drake, whose book, Black Metropolis, constitutes the classic study of the pariah communities created in the wake of post-Reconstruction immigration of Southern Blacks to the urban ghettos of the North. At Drake's encouragement, I taught an annual course in Caribbean literature that focused on Francophone, Anglophone, and Hispanophone authors, such as the novelist Alejo Carpentier, the poet Nicolas Guillen, the negritude poets of the French Antilles, Léon Damas, and of course, Aimé Césaire. With regard to the Francophone component of my teaching repertoire at Stanford, I found myself in the odd position of helping graduate students in the Romance language department in their doctoral dissertation research. These students lacked senior professorial mentors in their own field that were familiar with marginalized and overlooked Black writers outside of the mainstream of canonic French authors. My modest contribution to the agenda of curricular reform at Stanford equipped me and my colleagues with practical knowledge of a roadmap to be followed on the way to fulfilling, at least partially, our educational goals in the actual classroom, rather than merely from the pulpit. Consider the challenge to the reformers from the standpoint of the discipline of classics, which had come to be regarded as the very pinnacle of the unique achievement of Western civilization. Our proposed reforms were noted rooted in the historical observation that no civilization worthy of the appellation has ever arisen in a vacuum. The ancient Greeks, whom European cultural historians had placed upon a pedestal, were no exception. We pointed to the Western emperor who had lost his clothes in the famous fairy tale. Ironically, the Greeks themselves acknowledged their profound debt to the older civilizations of Egypt and the ancient Near East. The narrative motifs, for example, that structured the cosmogonic myths in Hesiod's Theogony have been traced back thousands of years to the Sumerians, Akkadians, and other peoples occupying the river deltas of Mesopotamia, known as the Fertile Crescent. In Greek biographical tradition, those much revered progenitors of Western science, the early Ionian pre-Socratic philosophers, such as Thales, Anaximander, and Pythagoras, were all believed to have visited Egypt. Thales' claim to fame of having predicted a solar eclipse in 585 BC is certainly to be attributed to his familiarity with knowledge bases coming out of Babylonian astrological tradition. What the culture wars brought to the fore was our clear responsibility as humanist scholars to follow the pedagogic imperatives that flow from this corrected vision of the interdependence of cultural knowledge systems, and to acknowledge the multicultural nature of the achievement of humanity as a whole in respect to the arts and humanities. Two strategies aimed at achieving the objective of transcultural humanities stood out as cardinal in our partial success. The first was the fruitful collaboration among faculty from diverse disciplines spanning the humanities and social sciences. The second, no less important, was the strategy of bringing on board key members of the higher echelons of university administration, such as deans, provosts, and presidents. In respect to the latter challenge, I well recall having had a provocative exchange with the Stanford dean, who had been genuinely baffled by my inclusion of Haiti as productive of an artistic culture worthy of academic study. In an exasperated tone, the dean had bluntly asked me, "Where are the cathedrals and other cultural monuments in Haiti?" And I looked at him and I said, "Well, can you point to a culture that had brought about the only successful slave revolt in history? Isn't that enough?" In the ideal scenario, the diplomatic maneuver of bringing the major academic power brokers on board is rendered less arduous if the caliber of the top administrators in the order of a Donald Kennedy in the case of Stanford, or Nan Cohen, or Dick Broadhead in the case of Duke. These lessons learned in the crucible of the cultural wars guided my future journey on the pathways to transcultural humanities. When I left Stanford to take up a primary appointment in classics at Cornell University in 1989, in the 5 years that I taught in Ithaca, New York, nested in the magnificent Finger Lakes, prior to my coming to Duke, it was my extraordinary good fortune to have been offered as successive appointments as chair of the departments of comparative literature and classics. Soon thereafter, I was granted the opportunity to serve as associate dean of humanities at Cornell, a post that allowed me to bypass the diplomatic maneuvers I spoke of earlier and to provide nurture, support, and promotion of faculty diversity in humanities departments and interdisciplinary initiatives. The then Cornell Provost, Don Randall, who later went on to head the Mellon Foundation, worked together with the decanal staff to boost the already flourishing fields of feminist theory and African studies at Cornell. Incidentally, it's at Cornell that I first met Srinivas Aramudan, who was then a graduate student at Cornell. Yeah. Since Cornell has long been blessed with a star-studded galaxy of faculty in the humanities and social sciences, my continuing commitment to the promulgation of a version of humanities characterized by transcultural orientation was met with unequivocal support from both dean and provost. So far, I have sketched the formative stages shaping my view of the need of a major reorientation of the humanities, education, prior to my recruitment to the Duke faculty. With this account as background, I turn to providing a response to Ranji's set of requests on the subject of today's presentation. I quote from the relevant paragraph of her invitation. I'd like to give a talk on what you envisage for your unit, for the college and the university more broadly in its efforts in the humanities, and indeed for the future of scholarship more broadly within and beyond Duke. Quite a challenge. In terms of what I envisage more broadly, my aspiration was to build upon and make significant contributions to Duke's already well-established platform based upon its genuine commitment to assembling a stellar humanities faculty whose research was at the forefront of exciting developments in literary theory and progressive socio-historical thought. Also paramount in my personal agenda was and continues to be the advancement of interdisciplinary perspectives across traditional departments and the conventional threefold divisions of humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. Duke's appointment offer to me was equally attractive because of the presence of the eminent scholars on its roster, such as Frederick Jameson, internationally famous Marxist critic, whose classic exposition, Marxism and Form, was a path-breaking contribution to the field. No less crucial to Duke's augmented visibility in literary theory was Stanley Fish, who was a leading exponent of the critical approach that was to acquire the label reader response theory. As a highly influential chair of the Department of English, Fish made full use of his position to hire innovative scholars such as Eve Sedgwick, who was coming to her peak as an outstanding researcher in the field of feminist studies, with a focus on gay subtexts in the works of literary canon. Her famously iconoclastic publication, Epistemology of the Closet, which appeared in 1990, was awarded second place in the MLA's prestigious prize for outstanding literary or linguistic study. The happy coincidence that the first place that same year went to Frederick Jameson provides striking evidence for Duke's rapidly growing reputation in the humanities. 2 years later, Sedgwick joined the ranks of the distinguished professoriate at Duke with her appointment to the Newman Ivy White Chair. I have singled out these 3 faculty appointments as especially noteworthy, but I wish to emphasize that the list of forward-looking hires at this institution is considerably longer than I could accommodate in this brief talk. I will never forget my job interview that I enjoyed at the time of my own prospective appointment in Classics in 1994. I had requested a secondary appointment in comparative literature and was afforded the distinct pleasure of meeting one of my intellectual heroes, Frederick Jameson, who presided then and now over his brainchild. I refer to Duke's acclaimed program in literature. As far as my own vision for the development of my chosen fields of classics and comparative literature are concerned, my focus on the teaching side of my portfolio was on courses directed at the general undergraduate population. In the program in literature, I offered an expanded version of the already mentioned class on Caribbean poetry that I had initially created at Stanford. In classics, my main offering in the direction of transnational perspectives was an introductory course on comparative mythology that I called Culture Heroes Across Cultures, in which, true to my widened horizons acquired in the culture wars, I demonstrated the usefulness of comparing representative figures from Greek heroic narratives, such as Achilles and Odysseus from the Homeric poems, with the counterparts in other mythological traditions, such as those transmitted in ancient Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Indian, and African cultures. The comparisons conducted in the course were centered on structural parallels in the biographies of the various heroes and on a body of shared cosmogonic motifs and themes. A version of this course also formed part of my occasional contribution to Duke's program in graduate liberal education. Within the core classical studies curriculum devoted to Greek and Latin language and literature, I found readily available support from colleagues such as Peter Burian, a scholar whose primary research focus has been on the translations, I should say, of Greek drama, and the late Diskin Clay, whose important work on the great Epicurean poet-philosopher Lucretius stimulated my interest in exploring the intimate underlying connection between poetry and philosophy, an interest that continues during my present phase of formal retirement. The fulfillment of an enlarged humanist vision on my part took part via my service to the college in my capacity as chair of classics initially. A subsequent stint as Dean of Humanities enabled me to promote the cross-cultural gospel, so to speak, among colleagues in a variety of disciplines. I will select by way of special illustration two of those disciplines that have a more or less close relationship to certain subfields within classical studies. I commenced with the Department of Romance Studies, in which I was called at one point to serve a one-year appointment as interim chair. The French component in its standard curriculum had at that time already begun to broaden its literary coverage by going beyond the mainstream canon through its institution of a Center for French and Francophone Studies, ably led by Professor Helen Salterer at that time. During my term as Dean of Humanities, I was in good position to give more than moral and intellectual support to the development of this program, an enterprise in which I confess I had a professional interest, as manifested in my research and teaching in the area of Francophone Caribbean poetry and the Negritude poets. It has been a pleasure to observe the growth and expansion of this dimension of the post-colonial French heritage under the current direction of Professor Anne-Gaëlle Saliot. A second humanist flowering on our campus that met with my undisguised approval in the form of decanal support under my watch was the Department of Religion, which substantially broadened its horizons beyond the Christian and Judaic traditions to embrace the study of Buddhism and Islam, among other non-Western cultural traditions. Duke University, I should note, had already acquired a deservedly high reputation in the field of religion, with its outstanding faculty in the Divinity School, whose research focus, of course, had been confined to Christian theology and homiletics. On the other hand, the expanded outlook of the Department of Religion in Trinity College, which takes an historically grounded approach to the study of religious systems, has, I believe, helped to foster, however sporadically, a less cloistered approach to the subject. It is an incident that occurred when I was dean, and having to do with the relationship between the religion department, the religion and the divinity school is worth telling, I think, and you can understand when I give you the story how there was a resistance to this idea of expanding the perspectives of the study of religion to include other religious traditions. There was a joint seminar offered by a distinguished professor in the Divinity School, who will go unnamed, who began his seminars, which were open to graduate students in the Department of Religion. He opened his seminars with prayer. And well, let's put it this way. Some of us in the administration at the time had to intervene and gently dissuade him from doing such a thing. In its many research intersections between the study of early Christianity and Roman history as taught in the Department of Classical Studies, Duke has benefited from the inspired contributions of the late Elizabeth Clark, who was a pioneer in unearthing the fundamental contributions of female intellectuals in the doctrinal maturation of the Christian Church, especially in relation to its dissemination of the faith in the Byzantine and early medieval periods. She has been rewarded for her spade work in this area of inquiry by Duke's recent renaming of the Center of Lake Antique Studies in her honor. Unfortunately, time does not permit me to give many further examples of interdisciplinary cross-fertilization at Duke, but I would be remiss in not mentioning a handful of scholars in Duke's impressive faculty roster who have enhanced the reputation and standing of the humanities. I signal, for instance, the seminal contributions of Richard Powell in the Department of Art, Art History, and Visual Studies, to the revaluation of Black art on an international scale, as well as those of his colleagues in the same department, of his colleague, I should say, in the same department, Hans van Meegroit, whose research and teaching, which is the late Hans Hemingway, whose research and teaching, some of it in collaboration with colleagues in economics, with a colleague in economics, Neil DeMarchi, have made a significant impact in an understudied subfield of art history. In the field of feminist critical theory, Duke's visibility was increased in no small measure by the appointment of the program in literature of Toril Moy, James B. Duke Professor of Literature and Romance Studies, and Professor of English, Philosophy, and Theater Studies. Her integrated multidisciplinary approach to sophisticated research enables or embodies the ideal of the literary scholar who, by virtue of her integrated approach to feminist studies, has been a major asset to the humanities' overall efflorescence at Duke, where she holds secondary appointments in the fields of English, Romance Studies, and philosophy. I have been imparting to you a partial and highly selective account of the important dimension of faculty development in framing Duke's rise to prominence in the arts and humanities. No account has so far alluded to the strategic appointment of individual faculty members in its meteoric rise to the ranks of the top 10 research universities in the nation. At this juncture, I want to fill an important gap in Duke's trajectory by pointing to the important role of collaborative teaching and research that has enhanced the quality of education in the institution as a whole. Within the constraints of this brief talk, I will limit my observations on this topic to mentioning a couple of my personal contributions to interdisciplinary instruction and research. In illustration of the former, I co-taught a seminar under the auspices of the embryonic FHI with two distinguished colleagues, Walter Mignolo, who has authored paradigmatic studies in the neglected contributions of non-European knowledge systems, especially in relation to the Hispanic colonization of Latin America, and Bruce Lawrence, who has done exceptionally insightful work on the religion of Islam while maintaining his participation in Protestant Christian history. Witness his freshly minted New English translation of the Quran, just came out a few months ago. This pedagogic experiment in adopting the perspective of alien civilizations and peoples in the case of partially marginalized societies in the misnamed New World represented for me a continuation of my ongoing commitment to transcultural humanities, along the lines I described in my collaborative course on Europe and the Americas that I had co-taught at Stanford with Professors Rosaldo and Pratt. In the domain of collaborative research between scholars of different disciplines, I cite as an example the Symposium on Negritude jointly organized by Michaeline Critchlow in the Department of Anthropology and myself, which led to the publication of a set of commissioned essays in a special issue of the Duke Journal South Atlantic Quarterly. I credit my co-organizer, Michaeline, with enlarging my own perspective on the Negritude movement by highlighting through a judicious selection of speakers the relatively neglected contribution of feminist intellectuals, such as the Martinican Suzanne Césaire, in the ideological shaping of the Francophone Caribbean's engagement in the project of decolonization. The picture I have sketched in broad strokes of the flourishing of the humanities at Duke would be radically incomplete if I left out of the account the central role of the FHI itself in the successful cultivation of humanistic studies in the 21st century. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I had the good fortune of having witnessed the inauguration of the Institute. I had participated actively in its pedagogic projects in its previous incarnation as a center at the Trent location. Those members of this audience who attended an earlier event in the current series of conversations will have heard a fascinating and deeply inspiring account of its incipient development from Kathy Davidson and Carla Holloway, who as co-founders were in an ideal position to remind us of the institutional challenges that were posed and successfully overcome in relatively short order. My initial involvement with the Institute was as a member of the advisory board in the earlier stages. However, I was able to make some more substantial contributions to the implementation of my vision of transcultural humanities during my stewardship of the Office of the Dean of Humanities. Here I would like to focus my historical lens on the remarkably fructifying accomplishments of the late Srinivas Aravamudan, with whom I worked closely in helping to integrate into educational mission of the FHI with those of the long-established departments in Trinity College. By a very fortunate coincidence, Srinivas assumed the office of director of the FHI in a period concurrent with my decanal term of appointment. Since my responsibilities as dean included formal supervision of the FHI, I took advantage of Srinivas's ardent and effective sponsorship of the humanities to strengthen the initially tenuous relationship between the no longer fledgling institute and the departments. I'm being a little diplomatic here, but there was tension. The major share of the credit belongs to Srinivas, who suggested that we could vastly improve the frayed communication between the two flag bearers of the liberal arts by arranging for the attendance of the FHI director at the regular monthly meetings of the chairs of humanities departments that I convened during my tenure of the deanship. It was a typically brilliant suggestion on the part of Srinivas, and by following it consistently under my stewardship, we together laid to rest the inchoate anxieties expressed sotto voce, for the most part, by some of the chairs over the proverbial allocation of funds to the new institute, a resource development that some saw as bypassing, if not overlooking, altogether the urgently increasing need for financial support for the traditional configuration of departments at a time of wholesale budget tightening in the school. During this phase of financial cutbacks that was hampering the spectacular progress of the humanities division, Srinivas and I were occasionally called upon to address the trustees in making the case for increased funding for the humanities and social sciences. Under the inspiring presidency of Richard Broadhead, who was as a well-respected professor of English, was wholeheartedly committed to seeking external funding from appropriate private foundations, as well as government sources, in support of the humanities, Duke experienced a great leap forward in its promotion of its signature humanities division. Professor Peter Lang, who also fully recognized and nurtured the promise of the FHI, put his extraordinary organizational skills to work in championing the agenda of enhancing the growing reputation of the Studia Humaniora, borrowed the famous Ciceronian appellation, Studia Humaniora, at the highest administrative level. It was the prescient Srinivas who was responsible for drafting the successful proposal to the Mellon Foundation that bore fruit in a major grant, a really major grant, something like $6 million, I believe, awarded to the FHI for the sponsorship of innovative projects to advance the role of the humanities at Duke. I quote from a short summary of the ambitious aims of the proposal, which bore the title of the Humanities Writ Large Initiative. About the Humanities Writ Large Initiative. Duke University has undertaken the 5-year initiative with generous support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, aimed at redefining the role of the humanities in undergraduate education. We recognize the need for citizens and leaders to be able to obtain knowledge, to analyze it, and to think and act collaboratively in innovative ways to address growing interdisciplinary and global challenges. Humanities are vital to providing the training and skills necessary to understand cultural similarities and differences, to sift through the daily fire hose of incoming information, and to make the imaginative leaps in research, scholarship, business, and policy to address the very many complex issues arising around us in our global world. We invite you to join us in altering the perception of the humanities, making clear the depth of their contribution to all the interdisciplinary endeavors taking place at Duke. Yes, isn't that something? Thanks to Srinivas's gifts as leadership, the FBI put the Mellon funds to superlative use by initiating projects such as the Humanities Labs, of which I think most of you are familiar. As a complement to his impressive local initiatives, Srinivas greatly elevated Duke's national and international profile as a leading research and university by his presidency of the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes. It's gratifying to observe how Duke's leadership role in national and international professional organizations in the humanities fields has continued in the able hands of the current FHI director, with her appointment as president of the American Comparative Literature Association for the 2024 to 2025 term. I close this presentation with a few considerations of my own regarding the future directions that I hope the humanities will take in making its voice heard and confronting the current existential threat to higher education now hanging over the United States. I would be happy to share my thoughts on this topic in the conversation to follow. Humanist scholars are uniquely equipped to launch and diffuse as widely as possible to the public at large an in-depth critique of the intellectual shortcomings of the mislabeled information age. A more appropriate moniker, in my opinion, would be the misinformation age. We should bring to the extra academic forum a non-trivial discussion of the nature and limits of the very concept of information, and explain the intrinsic subjectivity involved in the collection and interpretation of data. Has a nice objective sound, doesn't it? Higher education throughout its history has sought to train its students in the rigors of critical thinking and in questioning the retrograde promulgation of ideas that are devoid of any basic understanding of the principles and methods that inform what used to be called the human sciences, sciences humaines. We should redouble our efforts to expose uncritical assumptions and common misconceptions regarding the true cognitive potential of so-called artificial intelligence, and articulate more clearly the reasons why the label is a contradiction in terms. I like to say to my students, past, present, and I hope future, that I only relinquish my conviction that computer agency, in quotes, in the sphere of creative thinking is a genuine oxymoron. When a machine, without having been programmed to do so, self-consciously and spontaneously announces at some epiphanic moment, thought famously formulated by René Descartes, cogito ergo sum. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Gregson. The floor is open for questions.
I'll shamelessly start.
Oh, yeah.
I think there's been a lot of pressure in the humanities, not just at Duke, but everywhere, to focus on a broader public. In other words, appealing to the public more than it has been before. My own read is that the stems have gotten so complicated, you know, no citizen could understand even what we're doing here at Duke. What's your feeling on that? Is that a good thing? Should we be pursuing that? Should we be afraid?
Absolutely, absolutely, because the humanities, there's never been a time when humanities' voice is never needed. Really, truly. So even though it's frustrating to get a wedge in on the public discussion, we have to do this because what's at stake here is not just, you know, the quality of humanities instruction at Duke, but the future of not only higher education, but the society as a whole. We've got to take the lead. We've got to step up and go out there and reach out to the larger community. So, clearly, yeah. We're beginning to do that at Duke. I mean, we've begun to do that at Duke, but we need to just keep at it. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I thought somebody was.
Oh, Mark.
I certainly can. Thank you, Gregson, for this lovely reflection. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the trans in the transcultural, and given all of your experience with translation, how does that speak to the contemporary moment where we seem to be so polarized, right, and unable to speak to each other? Are there habits of mind or ethics around translation that might be mindful for the humanities in this area?
Yeah, habits of mind, yes.
also, I think a certain amount of general, I don't want to sound elitist, but ignorance of the nature of language and communication and so on. And I think here we are I think, remiss in not broadly explaining in broadest terms to the public, what it means to translate, for example. I mean, why it can't be done by computers in an adequate way, and the nature of language itself is at stake here. So, to answer your question a bit further, I think that scholars like Noam Chomsky, who has recently spoken out on artificial intelligence, need to do what was suggested earlier, which is to go out to the public and take ideas that really are fundamental to the understanding of communication and language in our time. Because this is very important, because all we have in prospect at the moment is a society that's grown up with the impoverished means of linguistic communication that take place on the internet. And I say deeply impoverished means. And it's responsible for a lot of misconceptions about how to communicate, from one language into another. So I don't know if I can suggest here, but I am not involved myself in a lot of activities on the computer. But I think we should address information, language, and fundamental concepts in language communication in order to get this generation of students understand what it is mean to read a text that's put out on the internet without examining the qualifications of the author, without examining standards, criteria of ascertaining the value and accuracy of the information and so on. We have to do this, because what are we going to end up with? Over the cliff we go, the lemmings. Yeah. Yeah.
I loved hearing you talk about the curricular innovations at Stanford with CIV, and you, as you I'm sure know, Duke just passed its new curriculum.
It did?
It did just pass. Yes, yes, I know. Big news, maybe.
Well, let me hear more about this. I have some ideas of what we should be passing. I realize
no comment. No, well, the question is that part of it is to create these century courses that are meant to be courses that transcend disciplinary boundaries and provide foundations. And then there's constellations, which is kind of like a mini focus. But I guess I was thinking about, what kinds of century courses do you think we need to offer?
Century courses?
Yes, century courses. So courses that are meant to be, a one-off large lecture perhaps, but that's transcending discipline. So maybe one of them is reading in the information age or something like that.
Reading in the information, definitely. Yeah. For example, helping to get an understanding of what's meant by information. Just the term information. What's implied in the term information? Objectivity, truth, and the like. And the whole idea of exposing the subjectivity in the concept. We absolutely need a course of this kind. I hope this is one of the ones that's proposed. Do they make concrete proposals of this kind in the curriculum? Actual courses or just general principles?
No, this is me thinking.
Well, I hope you will step forward.
Yeah, well, I may
teach such a course. Yeah. This is absolutely the first thing I'd look for. Yeah. Because people take for granted that information is something hard that you can pick up, and this crazy. And it's the whole purpose of higher education from the beginning and in the past has been to sort of get back to understanding of how you try to obtain the truth and whether it be in social terms or scientific terms, the nature of the universe and all these things, and that's what we should be doing. If nothing else, that alone would be huge. Yeah.
Gregson, thank you so much. As chair of classics, I invite you to do your own century course.
Well, I'm doing a lot of reduced teaching.
No, but I think
Sorry, Claire. I have the privilege of having well, I should say helping to appoint Claire.
Appoint me.
When we were looking for a paleographer to replace Francis Newton, and that was a great moment. I'm glad you're stayed here and have contributed so well to the progress of the department.
Thank you, Gregson. Actually, what I wanted to say, it was more of a comment, and I'm not sure that an answer is too complex, but the sense that I got from you describing your own experiences and the development, your own intellectual and teaching, that development is that there's very much a kind of an in-person transmission, the exchange of ideas, teaching, and we're in this AI moment, and somebody else has already brought up AI, but for me, the tension between spreading the gospel of humanities, like how do we read, how do we understand, how do we communicate knowledge in an internet world where how do we AI is there. My comment really is how do we scale the kind of reach that we need to spread the humanities without that kind of innovation? How do we work with it? Can we even work with AI? I don't know that there's an answer.
The curricular agenda of a course in this new program, which we just talked about.
Okay, well, I'll give the mic.
In other words, you and others should really focus in on this. It's absolutely needed right now. Yeah, and the question of how is not one that I can answer off the cuff, but I think we have to just ask probing questions and be critical of what's going on. Become the people who are the element in the university that ask the awkward questions, not by way of dismissing or saying this is the bad thing, but rather understanding what's going on. And that's what higher education should be doing. If we don't do it, we're lost.
Okay, thank you. I kind of wanted to follow up on this thing of interpersonal transmission. I was so struck by your story of, just sort of being encouraged to read in cultural and reading the Russian novelists, even as you're pursuing, graduate degree in classics. And in graduate school, I feel we're encouraged to do sort of one has to become an expert, in something. So how do we open that up? To give people more of those opportunities so they can really sort of chart their own path.
Yeah, I hear you. So you're asking a practical question. I actually made some efforts to do this, but it didn't get very far. So what I tried to do was to see if we could organize PhDs, encourage departments to sponsor PhD dissertations at Classics and Comparative Literature, in which professors from different fields would work in the dissertation, instead of the traditional way in which only the people in that discipline are on the PhD committee. But when I brought this up, to a group of faculty members when I was dean, everyone looked at me and they said, with an expression that says, "Leave us alone. Our hands are full."
Dissertations, fields we know nothing about, and it's going to be extra work for us. I mean, they didn't say like nothing, but that was a problem. So the how I think it has to be some such thing. We have to actually not just talk into this interdisciplinarity, but at the level of graduate development of graduate teaching, we need to have professors who don't just teach undergraduate courses,
who actually engage, you know, in higher level research, and especially the level of dissertation. And I don't know how to twist people's arms to do this, because it really requires a lot of extra for very, you know, busy fun. Oh, yes. Sorry.
I mean, I would say that some of the certificate programs do help with that.
Oh, that's a good point.
Feminist studies. Yeah, sorry. Feminist studies certificate program, the African American studies certificate program at the graduate level. They do.
At the graduate level.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think students benefit a great deal from those certificates. So that's one way. You know, and those are, of course, interdisciplinary fields, and so I think that there's, interestingly, those departments. I don't know where the conversation is in African American studies around this, but I know when I was chairing then women's studies, now gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, I was always pushing for a PhD, and there was resistance to the PhD on a number of different levels, and with, you know, partly with the idea that actually something else could be served, and something better could be served perhaps by a certificate program. I mean, I wasn't really thinking one at the expense of the other, but however, the certificate programs do something different, I think, and something important there. So.
Well, Gregson,
David, how are you?
as someone who went to Stanford in the 80s and got my doctorate here at Duke in the 2000s, I feel like we have many stories intersecting each other, although from my part, it's always from the subaltern angle, from below. Even as I could very easily also supply all the names that you omitted.
Oh,
Maybe they don't
I'll start by saying that my PhD in religious studies here was on the then interdisciplinary track, which ended with a dissertation with 2 words and no colon, after which that track was promptly shut down.
I didn't even know of its existence.
Well, now you know.
Yeah. How long did it last?
We can write the epitaph together. Yeah. I think it started in the late 90s and lasted about 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Religious studies?
Yes. Now, that is just a way of asking to reflect on the difference between interdisciplinary studies and the trends in your title, transcultural, and its relation to transdisciplinary ventures. It seems to me that there is quite a substantial difference between them.
Well, it could potentially be enlarged from the idea of this one discipline, traditional discipline, getting together with another traditional discipline.
So I'm sitting here in a row with 2 colleagues from the Interface Mellon Seminar from 06 or so. And in that convening of scholars and graduate students, we had people working on all kinds of things: literary, philosophical, theoretical, artistic, technological, scientific, and so forth. That was a very, very rare combination of competencies, interests, and stakes. But I remember having a discussion, kind of a disagreement really, with one member of that seminar, whom I won't name,
of course,
who was in the philosophy department doing interdisciplinary work between neuroscience and philosophy. And he insisted, I remember, that interdisciplinary work was when you're able to master at least two disciplines and then integrate them in your more or less specialized studies. That is a very different way of thinking about transversal inquiry, all right? Which goes beyond the strictures of any one or two or even three disciplines. And that brings me to the question of the humanities, the studia humaniora, as you name them, which in Cicero's time included architecture, right? The very first discipline, so to speak, in which Greek prose was written, as you know. Anaximander wrote the first techne, the technical manual for building or conceiving of structure. That seems to me to be the way to approach digital technology of our day, especially with its AI craze that purports to build a new world.
Yes.
And so my question is, would you consider a transcultural humanities project to be one in which all kinds of building and structuration must be included in the humanities?
I would completely agree with that. I think as I read between the lines of what you just said, the words, I think that what we're asking for is a prior sort of, or an initial change or reform within the disciplines themselves to make them transcultural. And then the two things would then come closer together conceptually, interdisciplinary and transcultural. Right now, you rightly point out, they're not synonymous at all. But right now, they're intersect in random ways. But what we have to do is to rethink the disciplines themselves, the way they're taught.
Yeah, and indeed cultures. Yeah, I mean, you named Islamic culture as non-Western, and I would contend that is debatable.
Yeah, I agree.
Islamic culture has dealt with Hellenic culture for much longer than Western European culture.
Yes, indeed. One area in which
de-siloing, it seems to me.
So here's a good example of where I think we could go with the STEM disciplines and the humanities and social sciences. This is one of my favorite examples of where I think we should be going. So take the idea of race in the first place, right? Which we all know to be a fiction, right? And the social anthropologists have been saying this for the early part of the 20th century, quite loudly, that this is a fabrication, a social fabrication. There's no such thing as a white race or a black race, and so on. And it hasn't had much of an effect. But what's happened recently is really exciting, which is that the genomics, the expansion of and the great discoveries being made in the field of genomics have now confirmed, right, the speciousness of the idea of race. And I think this is great because it brings together the sciences and the humanities over this matter, which this vexes our society so much. So I think that that kind of collaboration now across between the sciences, humanities, and is now made possible by this rise of the STEM sciences. The STEM sciences, for example, another aspect of genetics that's really exciting is epigenetics, where scientists are connecting that. We're coming up with the idea that the genes actually are capable of adapting to the environmental circumstances and so forth and so on. Well, this is getting close to an idea of, an integrated way of looking at at social issues, important social issues like race and racial hierarchies and so forth. And again, this goes beyond the idea of the discipline, the traditional discipline as well, right?
Yes.
So the biological sciences, humanities, and the social sciences need to do.
So we need to go beyond STEM and STEAM.
Yeah, and STEAM. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. We are over time. I mean, if I may just say also, from where you started, Gregson, with your description of your own education at Harvard as well, and your reading in anthropology, that it seems that from the very beginning, there was a way in which you were understanding your own task, like as someone who was a post-colonial classicist, as someone who was having to redefine the discipline in a way, because you were talking very consciously about the peculiarities also of the education system that define disciplines in a certain way, that much in concert with so many Caribbean writers who had written about the peculiarity of things like remembering giving an apple to a teacher when it must have been an orange, right? Those sorts of things. The way in which sort of the effectiveness of a colonial education system, right? In a sense, we understand now, I think, begs the question of how disciplines come into formation and why they come into formation, why they're shaped the way they were. So it seems to me that the transcultural and the interdisciplinary do come together through that kind of sense of the colonial formation of disciplines as well, which we cannot but think with and against, right? I'm excited to hear this new configuration now that you've just articulated as well.
If I were on the committee that you mentioned earlier, that's come up with a new cultural reform, I would argue strongly for the cultural anthropology as a required, absolutely required discipline or study.
Well, on that note, we should end. We are past time, and we've worked you very hard here, Gregson. And I just want to thank you not only for this really wonderful talk that I found just so inspiring and just instructive, and just what a life. What can I say? What an amazing life, and but also to thank you for the work that you've done over decades to change the way in which we can think the humanities and that we can work in the humanities, and it's just unbelievably inspiring. And so thank you.